photographs for wildlife monitoring. So to start, I'm going to give you a bit of background to my research, which has largely taken place in Africa. So I lived in Africa for a few years to work on this sort of stuff. And then I'll place this work into the current context within like the current biodiversity crisis that we have. We'll then speak about how and why wildlife monitoring can help with this crisis and the current shortcomings of commonly used monitoring approaches in Africa. And then this will flow into the bulk of my presentation, which will focus on using on how you can use tourist photographs for wildlife monitoring. And this part of the presentation is largely going to focus on the origins and the results of a study that was published last year, which is focused on working with the tourism industry in order to monitor large predators in Africa. So to start, to date, my research has largely focused on large African predator behavior and monitoring. And so specifically my PhD, which I finished last year, was looking at leopards behavior in Africa. So for those of you that don't know, leopards are large solitary cat species. They're found in India and in Africa. And across much of their range in Africa, they coexist with other large predators. So animals like lions and hyenas. And there's often intense competition between these animals. So these animals will compete for food, they'll compete for space. And if you have larger groups of these animals, or if you have larger animals that come across a smaller animal, they'll steal food from them, or in extreme cases, they'll kill them. And so leopards aren't the largest predator in Africa. And so my research was looking at how leopards can shift their behaviors in order to survive alongside some of these other animals like lions. And so for this, I lived in Africa for 2 years. And so I spent about half of my time following leopards and other large predators like lions in my Land Rover. And this allowed me to collect really detailed data on their behaviors. So here, for example, is a lion, and it's placing a scent mark in the environment, and that can help it to convey information to other animals that come in. And so for my work, I had to directly find these animals, then follow them in their natural environment. So I spent about half my time in Africa doing this. And then the second half of my time was spent trying to get my vehicle unstuck. So when you watch wildlife documentaries, you often see the animals in these very open and clear environments, like in the Serengeti. But in large parts of Africa, and particularly in my study area, these animals often occur in scrub or dense woodlands where there's long grass and they can hide themselves and seek shade. And so at my study site, finding these animals was a real challenge. And when you're trying to follow these animals in this sort of environment, it becomes very easy to get stuck. And that's relevant to now because that's sort of where the story starts for this tourist monitoring method. So the story begins with a leopard called Pavarotti. So this is Pavarotti here. He has one ear, and he was the large territorial male leopard that was in the center of my study area. And so every night when I went to bed, well, often I would hear Pavarotti calling. So you would hear him roaring in the environment. And then in the mornings, we would see his tracks in the sand where he'd walked. And so Pavarotti is one of those leopards that I was trying to follow so I could collect behavioral data. And there was this 2-month period where I was trying to find Pavarotti and I couldn't find him. And I would spend hours and hours and hours just driving through the environment, following his tracks, trying to find him. And he was just always so elusive. And it was one day I found his tracks and they were fresh, and I followed them off road, and I wasn't paying attention to what was under me. And the Land Rover collapsed into an old warthog burrow. And so I got stuck, and I spent a few hours trying to get unstuck. And a few hours into this, a vehicle approached, and it was from one of the safari lodges that was in the area. And he had guests, and they were talking to me, and we were chatting, and they told me that they'd seen Pavarotti that morning in another part of the study area. And then they disappeared. And while I was trying to get out for the remaining few hours, I really started to appreciate how much information the tourism industry collects when it's going out on these guided game drives. And what's sort of interesting is that my interest in using the safari industry for wildlife data wasn't part of my PhD initially, but it was this sort of experience of, trying to find these animals in this really tough environment that made me appreciate how much information people in the conservation sector could get from the tourism industry if there was a little bit more collaboration. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But first, to understand why this sort of behavioral research and monitoring is important for conservation, we really need to consider the situation that we find ourselves in now. And that's not a very happy one. So, to put it in a sentence, we're in a biodiversity crisis that's been largely brought on by human activities. So, some statistics. Since 1970, wildlife populations have declined by on average 60%. There are over 1 million species currently at risk of extinction, with hundreds going extinct every year, and 1 in 4 mammals are threatened with extinction. Unfortunately, as the biodiversity crisis deepens, the amount of funding that we have to address these challenges isn't keeping up with the pace. And so we're in something of a conservation funding crisis as well. And so, many of the world's wildlife areas operate well under the budgets that's actually needed for their conservation. So, if we take Africa as an example, for wildlife areas with lions, we need around 2 billion each year to manage those areas effectively. Yet, in reality, those areas have funding deficits of around 1.5 billion each year. And so this means that up to 94% of Africa's protected areas that have lions are underfunded. And these numbers are before COVID-19 even started. And the impacts that COVID is having on tourism is likely to increase this, funding gap even further. So we're in this situation where we can't save everything and we can't throw money at every location that needs it. And so we need to find a way to get our limited resources to the right locations at the right times in order to make the most of them. And one of the ways that we can do that is through wildlife monitoring. So when I say monitoring in this context, I essentially mean carrying out some sort of survey of the wildlife within a particular area to understand how things like total numbers of wildlife in that area are changing over time. And so this wildlife monitoring can provide us with the data for us to allocate our resources to the right areas at the right times and in the right ways. And I sometimes get questions from people saying things like, well, we know lions are in trouble. So why is monitoring them important? We're just monitoring them to extinction. And I agree with that to an extent. We need to pair monitoring with like conservation action. But monitoring is important because you need data to make the right decisions, and you need data to make decisions that don't have negative impacts on the populations you're trying to save. And the way you get that data is through monitoring. And when I say data here, what I'm specifically referring to is something like species density. So you want to know how many there are of a particular species of animal in an area and how that's changing over time. So how many lions are there in a 100 kilometer squared area of a protected reserve? And how does that change over 5, 10, 15 years? And then you can make concrete data-driven decisions about when to intervene and where to allocate your money in order to get the most impact. Unfortunately, wildlife monitoring itself tends to be quite expensive. And so we end up in this like catch-22 situation where we need monitoring to make better use of our limited resources, but we don't have enough of those resources to do the wildlife monitoring in the first place. So it ends up like this vicious cycle. So for example, camera traps are one of the most widely used tools to monitor wildlife, and they're used across the world, not just in Africa. So a camera trap is essentially, it's a camera which is attached to some sort of sensor, and it's placed in a weatherproof box. And when an animal walks in front of the camera trap, the camera gets triggered to take a picture or a video of the animal. And you can use this information to look at who's in your area and how many of them there are. So these are great for detecting and monitoring a wide range of species. And they're great because once you put them out in the environment, you can collect that information on what's walking past as long as the camera trap is active. You get that information day and night. And as well as allowing you to monitor who's in an area and how many of them there are, it can give you insights into behaviors that you're unlikely to see directly. So this, for example, was a caracal hunting. And so you're unlikely to see that caracal in the daytime. You're unlikely to see that caracal if you're driving around because they're very shy. And so these camera traps are really, they're a non-invasive way to collect information on the wildlife within a particular area. So they're great, but they're also very expensive to put out. So one camera trap, a good camera trap alone can cost $150. And if you want to carry out a survey to monitor how many wildlife there are in your area, you need around about 30 cameras per study. So the cost can quickly rack up for even just like the initial equipment purchases. And that's even before you start to look at additional costs like damage from wildlife. And so in Africa, your camera traps are at risk from animals like elephants that will knock them over. And so you need to continuously be driving around, checking those camera traps, making sure they're still there, making sure they're still functional. And so on top of those costs for the camera, you have costs for fuel, you have costs for the cameras that get damaged. So I had cameras that were knocked over by an elephant, and then a hyena would come and it would take them and crunch them and take them away. And we would never see them again. And then we would have to buy more cameras to replace them. Another example of a popular way to monitor wildlife is through track surveys. So that's essentially when you walk around your study area along a predefined route and you record all of the instances that you see a track of the species that you're trying to monitor. So this, for example, is a track of a lion. What I would do is if I wanted to monitor lion populations in the area is every morning for maybe 2 weeks, I would get up and I would walk along this predefined route and I would record every time I saw a lion track. And then you put this information into a statistical model and it will give you a very rough estimate of how many lions are in that particular area. So they're a relatively simple and cheap way to monitor carnivore densities. They're really low tech, but they also have their limitations. So first, your estimates are only ever going to be as good as your trackers. So you need someone like we had, which is last there, who's good enough to accurately identify tracks of the different carnivores across a range of different substrates. So in thick sand and light sand. And even then, even if you have the greatest tracker in the world, their ability to identify tracks is constrained by your field conditions. So for example, if you have a very hard surface like concrete and the concrete's dry, the animal is not going to leave an indentation when it walks across it, so you can't use track surveys. When the rains come as well, the tracks either get washed away or you get stuck. So as a disclaimer, I was not driving this vehicle. This was being driven by a colleague of mine who's also from Santa Cruz. And it's sort of an example of how difficult it is to really collect data in this environment when you have to drive around yourself and manually collect it. And then finally, you have something called call-in station surveys. And this is when you play a sound which you think is going to draw in the animals that you want to monitor. So for example, if I wanted to count how many lions we had in a particular area, I would drive out to maybe 10, 20 different locations over several nights, and I would play in the sound of a dying buffalo. And I would count how many lions came to that sound. And again, if you take those numbers and you put them into some sort of statistical model, it will give you a very rough estimate of how many lions are in the area. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of all the monitoring methods that are out there, and this isn't an exhaustive list of all the advantages and disadvantages of these different methods. But the one commonality that monitoring methods tend to have is that they require a significant amount of resources to collect the data that's needed for getting these species densities. And this is a problem because it limits the total area that you can monitor. and it limits the amount of time that you can monitor that area for. And so what normally happens is a researcher will get funded for a specific research project. They'll come in to monitor the wildlife in that specific area. And then when the funding stops, the monitoring stops as well. And so you tend to have these really discrete periods of monitoring with these large gaps in between where you have no idea what's happening with those wildlife. But if you think about it, this is where wildlife tourists can be a very valuable resource. So tourists and guides are super interested in trying to find many of these animals that we're trying to monitor in other ways. But they're still often an overlooked source of information. So if you think about it, you have hundreds of thousands of tourists visiting Africa's protected areas every year, and they're taking millions of photographs in total. And I don't think we really know what the full potential of that data is. And so that's what this specific project that I'm going to be talking to you about set out to understand. We wanted to know whether tourist photographs could be used for wildlife monitoring, in this case for large African predators. And so for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to focus on a study that was published last year, which was looking exactly at this question. Now, I've given like variations of this talk in other places, and the one thing that consistently comes up afterwards is it's really obvious and it's a really simple idea. Surely there's someone else doing it. And yet, when I brought this idea up with my colleagues in Africa, and when I started to mention it to the safari industry contacts, there was a lot of debate about whether it would work at all, and there was a lot of initial pushback. And so this initial question can be simplified into three smaller ones that really sort of capture the concerns that were being raised at the beginning. So first of all, there was concern about whether tourists would even want to share the photographs with us. So a lot of pushback we got was, I mean, people go on holiday to escape. They don't want to talk to researchers and they don't want to do something that involves work for them. Uh, the second concern was, even if we get the images from them, can we translate all of that noise into something that's actionable for conservation? So can we turn those photographs into densities that conservationists and wildlife managers can then act on? And then finally, what does it cost us? Because even if we can get these densities, if it costs us an arm and a leg to get them, we end up with that same issue of sustainability. We end up in this catch-22 situation around resources again. So, how did we set out to answer these questions? So to answer these questions, I set up a monitoring project at my study site in Botswana, which is illustrated here. So Botswana is a landlocked country in Africa, in the southern part. And if we zoom in, we can see my study area in a little bit more detail here. So I worked out on the fringes of the Okavango Delta, which is in the northern part of Botswana. And this area in green shows the main areas where I carried out my research. So this is an area that was specifically set aside for wildlife tourism. So this was an area that's managed by the local communities, and the communities sublease this area to safari companies who operate private lodges. So each of those stars there is a private safari lodge that was operating in the period where we carried out this monitoring study. And one of the reasons that the area was so popular was that I had all of Africa's 5 large carnivores there. So we had lions, we had spotted hyenas, we had leopards, we had cheetahs, and we had African wild dogs. And so these were also the species that I studied with the Botswana Predator Conservation Trust. And these were the species that we were initially interested in understanding whether we could get the densities from them from the tourist photographs. So that's the study site. In terms of how we collected the data, we wanted to make a workflow that made it very, very easy for the tourists to get their photographs to us. And that was because of the concerns around they're on holiday, they might not want to share it with us if it requires a lot of effort, which is totally understandable. And so what we did was we partnered with one of those 3 safari lodges, and it was a safari lodge called Santawani. And this is what we did. They had new guests that would come in every 3 days. And so every 3 days, one of our team would go out and speak with the guests. And we would tell them about the project, and we would ask them if they were happy to share their photographs with us on their final night. If there was anyone that said they were happy to share with us, they would get this little GPS unit. So this is the size of a large keyring, and this would automatically track where the guests were going on their game drives. So every minute, it automatically recorded the time and the GPS location. The guests didn't have to do anything with this. They could just put it in their pockets or their backpack, and that was it. Then on the guests' final evening at the lodge, we would go over while they were having a barbecue. We would collect their images while they were around the fire. And then finally, once we had all of that information, one of our team would go through all of the images. They would identify where those large carnivores had been seen, and they would take the timestamps for the photographs, and they would cross-reference them with the GPS timestamps. And that allowed us to see not just who they were seeing, but when they were seeing them and where in the landscape they were seeing them. So by cross-referencing the timestamps from the photos and the GPS data, we could see exactly how much driving it was taking to find these animals and where in the landscape they were finding them. And this whole data collection process took about 10 minutes. So every 3 days, we spent about 10 minutes to collect all of this data. And in terms of how much time it took to process that data, I'll talk about that a little bit later. And so we ended up with this collection of pictures. And what we wanted to do was turn that into something else. And so what we did was we took all of those individual pictures, and along with the GPS data, we put them into some fancy statistical models, which aren't much fun to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about them too much. But the gist of it is we put them into these statistical models, and the theory was that we would get species density estimates. So by combining the photographs from the tourists with the GPS data, we had a way to theoretically get density estimates for the different carnivores within the study area. And I'll mention a little bit later whether that was reality or not. And so we carried out this tourist monitoring approach over 3 months in Botswana. And around this same time period, we also carried out carnivore surveys using the 3 other approaches that I mentioned earlier. So we also did a camera trap survey, we did the track survey, and we did the calling station survey. And the reason that we carried out these 4 things at the same time was we wanted to compare the densities that we were getting from the tourists against the densities from these other 3 methods. So these other 3 methods are widely used across Africa, and the densities that they give are often considered fairly reliable. So by comparing the densities from the tourists against the densities from these other approaches, we could get some measure of whether we could trust the data that we were getting from the tourist photographs, because there's no use if they're giving us a number, but we can't rely on that number. So this was a way for us to validate this approach. So let's look at the results. So the first question we wanted to test was whether we could actually get tourists to share the photographs with us. I mean, if they say no, then the project's gone. But luckily, the answer was yes. So we spoke with 26 groups over those 3 months, and we got photographs from them all. So we ended up with over 25,000 photographs, and around 30% of these were of those carnivores that I mentioned earlier. And these photographs were from 171 different sightings. And what we found was that the guests were actually super excited to share the photographs with us and contribute towards conservation. And it wasn't uncommon for other guests to try and give us their photographs during the stay. So we initially normally had 2 or 3 people that were happy to give the photographs, when we tried to collect the images, there was often more people giving us their SD cards, which is really positive. In terms of what carnivores they saw, lions were the most commonly sighted carnivore, followed by leopards and then wild dogs. Spotted hyenas were spotted relatively rarely, and that's important to remember for later. And cheetahs were only seen twice. But what's really interesting here is that cheetahs were only detected in the area through the tourist photographs. So we didn't get any sightings of cheetahs from the camera traps. We didn't see any cheetah tracks, and no cheetahs came into those sounds that we were playing to attract animals. So the only one of our survey methods to detect cheetahs in the area was the tourist photograph method. We also spoke with the guides after every guest group, and everything that they said they'd seen over the past 3 days matched with what the photographs from the tourists told us. So it seems that the guests took photographs at every carnivore sighting that they went to, which is what you would actually expect. Because if you think about it, these are the sexy species that people tend to want to see when they come to Africa. Now, this is really good because it means that guests are consistently taking pictures of predators and they're consistently happy to share the data. But the next question is, can we turn that data, can we turn those photographs into something useful for conservation? So can we translate those pictures into density estimates? Now here it's important to say that in order for us to get density estimates using those statistical models I mentioned earlier, we need an extra layer of information on top of what species has been seen and where. We also need to be able to tell individuals of the species apart. So it's not enough to say we saw a lion, we need to know exactly which lion it was. So the next question was, can we tell individuals apart using the photographs that the tourists were giving us? Before I blow your mind with the results, I'm going to give you a quick primer on predator identification. So for hyenas, leopards, wild dogs, and cheetahs, individuals all have this unique body color and patterns that you can use to tell them apart. So hyenas have these black marks, splodges on them. Leopards have this pattern of rosettes. Wild dogs have these 3 colors, and cheetahs have these spots. And you can effectively use these like fingerprints to tell one individual apart from another individual. And over time, it becomes quite easy to look at these individuals and just pick out these patterns. So I've been talking for quite a long time now. So if we can put this into practice, so we can do a quick pop quiz. On the left, we have the handsome leopard goose. And here we have an unknown mystery leopard, which was taken by, let's say, a tourist. So I'm going to give you 60 seconds to take a look at that picture, look at the rosette patterns, and see if you can figure out whether that leopard on the right is goose or whether it's someone different. So I can see the chat. You can chat it out, and then I will tell you the answer after. All right, so I will give you the answer. It is, so it's goose. So for those of you that identified them as goose, 5 stars. So with these animals, I've highlighted the body patterns that I use to tell this one apart, but you can use pretty much any combination of like rosette patterns that are distinctive to you. And so for these body patterns, it's relatively easy to tease apart from the tourist photographs whether you're seeing leopard A or leopard B. But the situation becomes more complicated for lions. So lions have this uniform body coloration, and so you can't use like the body to tell these individuals apart. Instead, you have to use the whisker spots. So for lions, for cats, these whisker spots remain consistent across their lifespan, from when they're cubs to when they die. And specifically, you need to focus on the top row of the whisker spots. And you can use the space in between the spots in the top row to tell individual lions apart from one another. So again, here on the left, we have Achilles, and on the right, we have an unknown lion. So is the unknown lion Achilles, or is it someone new? And I'll give you about 30 seconds to have a look at that one. Yeah, so this animal here is not Achilles. It's a different lion. So for those of you that said that, 5 out of 5. And the thing really to appreciate here is how much harder theoretically it's going to be to tell individuals apart from tourist photographs for lions. So the whisker spots are such a small area for lions that you need to be able to zoom into that specific area, and the image can't be that blurry, otherwise it's very difficult to tell them apart. So arguably for all of those 5 species, lions are going to be one of the hardest species to tell apart. So whether that's Achilles or another lion. So now that we have this sort of insight, we can look at whether that conform to reality. So this table is going to show us for each species how many of the different individuals we were actually able to tell apart. So how many of the different individuals we were able to identify to the individual level. And it shows that despite the challenges of honing into those tiny whisker spots, we were able to identify 91% of the lions at tourist sightings to the nearest level. And so for all of those survey methods, camera traps are the only other method where you can identify the animals to the individual level. And we were only able to identify 65% of the lions in camera trap images to the individual level. And this trend is pretty much consistent across all of the different species. So the tourist photographs give us a very good ability to identify those animals to the individual level. And that's because often tourists are using very good cameras. And even when the animal's not directly looking at the camera, they take so many pictures in sequence, there will be a good picture in that sequence where you can tell that individual apart. So tourist photographs, you can get individual identities for them, which is super important for densities. So the next question is, when we put all of that information into those statistical models, will the model work or will it fail? And if it does work, can we trust the numbers that it's given us? Because if they're wacky estimates, it's not good to anyone, right? So we wanted to validate our approach against those other commonly used survey approaches. So camera traps, track surveys, call-in stations. So on the bottom axis here, you have density. And then on the y-axis, you have panels for each of the different monitoring methods. And here are our densities for the carnivores from the citizen science method. So each color is for a different species. The circle is the average, and the dashed lines are the 95% confidence intervals. So you don't need to know exactly what that means in terms of confidence intervals. The only thing to bear in mind is if these dashed lines overlap for the different survey methods, it means that the densities are the same as one another. So I'm going to go through each of these species one by one to show you exactly what that means. So for lions, The confidence intervals for the citizen science, the tourist photograph method, overlap with the confidence intervals for all these other survey methods. So the densities that we get for lions from the tourist photographs are comparable with the other monitoring methods. And we see the same for African wild dogs. You see that overlap, and also for leopards. So you've got that overlap. So for these species, the citizen science method seems to be producing robust estimates of densities, which means that we can trust them. For hyenas, it's less so. The density estimates for hyenas seem a bit wacky and a bit off. And we think that's simply because we didn't get that many hyena sightings at the study area. So I think hyenas were only seen about 8 times over that 3-month period. And we think that if we collected data from more safari lodges at the same time and over a longer period, we will be able to overcome that problem relatively easily. So on the whole, the method performs very well. It gives densities comparable to these other survey approaches. You just need to be able to see the animal enough. So that's great. The next question is, how much does it cost? Because it's great the results are comparable, but if it's too expensive, then it's academic. You have the same problems as before regarding sustainability. So if we look at the total costs, the costs for the tourist photograph method are cheaper than the other survey methods for the camera traps and the Collins station surveys, and it's around about the same price as the track surveys. And then if we look at this breakdown of whether the costs are down to the equipment, the data collection, and the data processing, we see a couple of interesting things. So one of the most interesting things to take away from this is that most of the costs for the tourist photograph method are from data processing. And that's important for something that we're going to chat about later. Another important thing to remember here is that although the costs of the tourist method and the track survey method are similar, the images from the photographs give you a much richer layer of information than the tracks do, and so they're arguably more valuable. You don't just get densities, but you get information on their condition. So are they healthy? Are they injured? Who are they working with? What are they feeding on? This is all information you don't get from the track surveys, but you get from the tourist photographs. So as a summary, we had these 3 questions. We found that tourists are happy to share their photographs. We found that the data does give us accurate densities. And we found that it costs less than other similar monitoring approaches. So moving forward, 2 really interesting things about this study are that it only took us around 10 minutes of work every 3 days to collect this data from the guests. So it was relatively unintensive to collect the photographs from the guests. And the second really interesting thing is that around 50% of the costs for this tourist photograph method were down to data processing. And so these 2 points offer really big opportunities to scale this monitoring approach through targeted partnerships with the safari industry and also technology companies. So if we consider the role that safari lodges could play first, if you think about the study I've just spoken about, one of the main limitations of it is the fact that we needed researchers to collect the data. Now, that's not very sustainable if you want to collect this data over very large areas where you would need a researcher based at every single lodge. So what you could do with a little bit of work is you could have this really simplified and streamlined workflow where you have the photographs being collected by the lodges as part of their everyday activities. For example, you can have the guests being told of this project during the health and safety talks when they first arrive into the camp. And then you could have the images being collected in the final evening when the guides are having dinner with the guests. And so you just need to have this little bit of legwork into putting these collaborations in place and showing those lodges initially the value that this monitoring approach has, both in terms of the guest experience and also in terms of the data that they can get to better manage the resources in their area, which they're already trying to do just through other approaches. And so at the start of the year, I was out in Botswana, And I was training lodge staff with natural selection safaris, who are partners in this new stage of the project. So I was training their staff at several lodges and building up these collaborations so they can collect the data themselves. Now, obviously, this is on hold with the pandemic, but the structures are in place so that once the conditions are right again and tourism returns to that area, they have everything in place to collect this data from the tourists. And so we already had 2 to 3 months of data from the beginning of the year before quarantine lockdown, and it was all progressing really well. And so this really helps address the issue of how do you collect this data over large spatial scales and over a large period of times. The answer is you don't collect it. You work with local stakeholders and you support them so that they can collect it. Now, this of course raises a bottleneck in terms of data processing, and it raises the question of how do you process this data? So we had 25,000 images over 3 months from one safari lodge. If you have 4 safari lodges, you have 100,000 images coming in every 3 months. How do you process that data without getting bogged down? And this is where technology companies could come in. So I'm currently working with an organization called WildMe, and they've created these machine learning algorithms that can detect patterns in species body coats that they can then use to tell individual species apart. So they started developing these algorithms initially for whales, and they've moved on to these other species like zebras. But we're currently working with them to launch these algorithms for large African predators. So the idea would be that we can then collect this data from the safari lodges. We can upload it to this WildMe programs. The programs can automatically process that data, tell us who the individuals are, and then we can just plug that into the statistical models. Citizen science also offers huge opportunities to address this data processing bottleneck. So I'm in the final stages of launching a project on the Zooniverse platform. It's going to be called Wild Sites Botswana, and it's going to allow people from all across the world to help classify and process these data sets. And that'll help address this bottleneck as well. So that should be up within the next month or so. So some final closing thoughts. This monitoring approach isn't a silver bullet, and it won't work in all areas, and it won't work for all species. There's no such thing as a silver bullet in conservation. This is just another super useful tool that conservationists can draw upon to help them, conserve the species within these really tough environments. It's particularly well suited for these large, sexy species that occur in tourism areas. So large predators in Africa, whale watching, these are all industries that could benefit from this approach. And it offers this really neat opportunity for scalable wildlife monitoring in tourism areas, particularly when you start to build these partnerships with the safari companies and you start to bring technology in these strategic places to cut down on the monitoring costs. And so that's my talk done. Thank you for listening. I'm just going to finish with my favorite camera trap video that I took. So this is Rolo, my favorite leopard, and it's him falling out of a tree and then pretending it didn't happen. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Yay! That was great work, Kasim. That was awesome. We have some questions in the chat.
Cool. Yeah, I can go through them now. I've got the chat up. So I'll go through them in order. So first question, what about identifying scars in lions? So scars and ear notches are a really good way to be able to narrow down roughly to a subset of individuals that you can then match the whisker spots or the body pattern against. But they're not the gold standard because scars can heal and they can change over time. So we do use scars sometimes for identifying individuals it might be these 3 individuals because they're heavily scarred, but we'll never rely on it as a gold standard. There are some exceptions. So Pavarotti, for example, only has 1 ear. So we're pretty confident that when we see a one-eared leopard, it's Pavarotti. But most of the time, it's a combination between these marks that can change over time and then these gold standard marks. The next question is, biodiversity is threatened by livestock, which uses about 30% of the land surface of the earth. Eating wildlife and domestic meat plus deforestation for livestock causes pandemics. Did you see these factors in Botswana? Yeah, so in that map I showed you of the study area, let's see, we also have a area that is set aside for livestock use. So although my study took place mainly in the protected area, which is the green area, directly below there, you see these little markings, which are like diamonds with cows in them. These are farms. And so there was conflict just south of the area that I was working in. And so, yeah, we sometimes saw the consequences of conflict in these areas. These animals have very large home ranges. They don't know what a protected area is and what a non-protected area is. And so they navigate across these areas. And that sometimes results in conflict. And so we, at the Botswana Predator Conservation, we also work with these livestock farmers, and we work with local communities to try and understand what are the drivers of the conflict and help mitigate that. So it's benefiting the people and it's also benefiting the wildlife. So yeah, we saw aspects of that. Yeah. Next question. So lions were the most spotted carnivore for the tourists. Why? Are there more lions, or are the lions more visible? Lions are easier to find for a number of reasons.
Hours a day.
Yeah, so they sleep for like 20 hours a day.
Yeah.
They also have very large footprints, so it's very easy to follow those footprints and find them. And the guides are very, very good at finding these animals. Lions also occur in groups, so they're the only large cat that occurs in groups, and so it's easier to see them in the landscape. And so they were seen the most because they're larger, they're easier to see, and their tracks are easier to follow. There's not necessarily more lions than wild dogs and hyenas in the area. So the hyena densities in the area are probably higher than the lion densities. It's just that they were easier to find.
I actually have a question. You mentioned the leopard Pavarti, I think his name is, that you'd see a lot.
Yeah.
Was there ever a time where you noticed out in the field that some of the wildlife recognized you or anyone you worked with?
So the wildlife, they would behave so the wildlife in the area are all habituated. So they are used to the vehicles, and they sort of don't really get bothered by the vehicle so much. You don't see any obvious changes in their behavior. I didn't see any particular like occurrences of like Pavarotti recognizing my vehicle specifically and reacting differently to me versus like another vehicle. But it's interesting because animals do shift their behaviors depending on whether vehicles around. So there's a nice story that kind of illustrates this, which is wild dogs. They're one of the smallest, well, they're the smallest large predator of all the ones I mentioned. And they normally have their kills stolen by these other animals. And there was one instance where they came across the carcass of, I think it was a buffalo, and one of my colleagues was sitting with the dogs just recording their behavior, and they had pups with them, so they're very young offspring, and they normally like stay with the offspring because I mean they're at risk of other predators. So if a lion comes or a leopard comes, they'll stay with the offspring until that animal moves away, because otherwise the lion or the leopard will kill that animal. But while they were sitting there at this kill site, at this buffalo, a leopard came. He must have smelt the kill as well. and he was just like patrolling around the area, just looking. And he wasn't habituated, so it was a new leopard. He wasn't used to the research vehicle, so he wasn't coming closer. And what the adult wild dogs was, they just disappeared. They just disappeared and left the pups with the kill and with Neil, who was watching them, because it was like the vehicle was a shield, and they were able to like leave the pups with the vehicle as a babysitter, and they were fairly confident the leopard wasn't going to come in. So I didn't see any instances where the animals recognized a particular vehicle and changed their behavior, but they would generally change their behavior around vehicles.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
No worries. So another question. I read that WWF is using a digital crowdsourcing platform for data collection. Is this a method you can use? Yes. So there are a number of like initiatives which are collecting data using citizen scientists, where you have the central database and you have the central system. And if you see an animal or a plant of interest, you can upload that site into the database. And that is super, super useful. The difference between those methods for Africa and the method that I used was, although you have these websites where you can like create a central database and you can ask people themselves to send that information to you after like they've been on safari, you can rarely use that information for getting, you know, like a good estimate of the density. And that's because if no one sends you a picture of a lion on the 10th of March, is that because no lions were seen on the 10th of March? Or is it because just no one decided to send you a picture there for some other reason? And so you don't really have any measure of like how reliably you're getting that data. And you don't have all of that sub information like search effort and where specifically in the landscape it's being seen that you need to calculate densities. So although we're partnering with other initiatives where you can send in this data ad hoc, like this digital crowdsourcing platforms, we're combining that alongside this more intensive like collaboration with the lodges, because the two data sources like complement one another quite nicely. Do wild dogs hunt in packs like hyenas? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so they hunt, and the hunting strategies they use differ depending on like the landscape. So if you've ever seen a David Attenborough documentary, and they show wild dogs hunting, you see that they seem to have these really coordinated behaviors where, you know, every animal has a role within the hunts and they're like behind each other, and then the ones at the front tire and the ones at the back go to the front. So that's one hunting strategy. In Botswana, they tend just to run around like mad, and then they just run after things. But they're still quite efficient.
Did you have, can you hear? Did you have many elephant run-ins, or were they that much of a population there? You had one photo there.
Yeah. Yeah, so the elephants consistently took down camera traps. We used to have to check them a week, like every week, to make sure they were still up or they had been bent over. We had to design like steel cases for the cameras to stop them getting damaged by the elephants. The, the elephants is interesting because I've been working at the site for 5 years. And when I first started working at the site, I mean, this is anecdotal, but when I first started working at the site, the elephants were being hunted in the area just south of us. So it was like the hunting industry in Botswana was still active at that point. And you could see that the temperament of the elephants was different compared to like my most recent stays in Botswana, where like it'd been several years since hunting had taken place. And so in those early years where I worked there, when we were driving around, even if we were stopped and we were watching an animal and an elephant came by, it wouldn't be happy and it would shake its head and it would like mock charge us. Whereas there was less run-ins in my most recent stay in Botswana, I guess because there was like that less antagonism, maybe. I'm not sure. But yeah, we had run-ins with elephants with camera traps, and also sometimes you just get a grumpy elephant and they don't like the vehicle.
Yeah.
And they just show you.
Thank you. I am a wildlife biologist, but I was trying to do some stuff over in Africa, '05 to '08, but I just ended up living with the Maasai tribe because there wasn't any, they wouldn't let you do any stuff unless, you know, organized like you were. But I know the elephant in Amboseli, the elephant trust, she's been working, studying the elephants for a good 40 years. So they've got a really good system down there. But when I was there, you know, that wasn't that many years ago, the lions seemed to be plenteous. And then, you know, the last decade or less, I've heard that they're getting so rare, which is hard for me to believe because they did seem to be abundant. Do you have that same in Botswana? Are they very unusual to have, you know, are their numbers
Yeah.
going way, way down?
Yeah, so in the protected area, like the area where I was working, the numbers are fairly stable. But generally, the trend in Botswana is declining. Yeah. Yeah, and like the main causes for mammal declines and wildlife declines in general are you have a growing human population, and like you have more space that's required to meet the needs of that population, and so you have like encroachment onto the habitat of the wild animals, and as you have more encroachment, you get more conflict. So yeah.
Yeah. But before you sign off, I didn't know there was any research in the area. I'm interested up there. I've done go to archaeology meetings when we had them, and a lot of the UCSC kids came down to those. And can whoever's in charge or somebody get in touch with me? I signed up. Name's Shirley Johnson. I can give you a phone number or whatever, because any stuff on the you know, endangered species, the larger mammals, that's my cup of tea.
Yeah, we can connect offline. If you give your email, or yeah, I can get your email from Megan, or how, and then we can chat about it. Yeah.
Okay, that'd be great, because this is super to know there's stuff I'm interested up in there.
Yeah, no worries.
Megan, do you want to email, or you have one from?
I accidentally sent this to everybody, but if you can just privately send me your email in the chat, that would be great. And then I can set up the
I don't know how to do that. I'm sorry, I'm not very computer.
your name's Shirley Johnson. I'll find it in the RSC.
You'll find it. Can you do that? Appreciate that, Megan.
Of course.
We had a lot of these species at Sacramento Zoo back more than 40 years ago when I was a keeper up there. So, but I recognized the cat, the serval cat, right away when I saw the picture. We had a few of those. Yeah, they're pretty unusual.
Yeah, they're iconic. Yeah.
I saw once in 4 years over there.
Hard to see as well. Yeah. Cool. Thanks everyone for joining in. If you have any questions or want to reach out as well, I guess you can contact Megan, and then you can pop me an email and we can chat that way.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating, and it turned out like I presumed, because I was trying to do a tourism business, take people to see the regular game drives, and then to see the Maasai people in the middle of the day and evenings. And yeah, so I spent a lot of time going to the main campground where a lot of the tourists were on camping, and be a chance to practice my German and Spanish and so on. And
All right, any more questions? Okay, thank you, Kasim, so much. This was super cool. We all learned a lot today, and I really enjoyed this. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, you're welcome to reach out to Wise or me, and then we can get you in contact to ask your questions.
Great. Thank you. This has been the most interesting Zoom I've done in the last 2.5 months. So. I was doing some animal drawing stuff on classes, but this is the best. So much thanks.
Thanks,
Well, I'm glad that you can make it.
Oh, is that with its hands? Cool.